The North Atlantic in winter is one of the most hostile environments known to seafaring peoples. Temperatures plunge below freezing, waves tower above the deck, salt spray coats every surface in a film of ice. And for the Vikings, who crossed these waters in open wooden ships for trade, exploration, and conquest, survival depended on solving a problem that defined their maritime culture: how to stay warm when fire could not be used. The longship was a masterpiece of engineering. Light, flexible, and fast, it could navigate rivers and cross oceans with equal ease. But it was also a vessel built almost entirely of flammable materials: oak planks, tarred joints, woolen sailcloth, hemp rigging. In confined quarters, with wind gusting unpredictably and seawater sloshing across the deck, an open flame was not just dangerous, it was catastrophic. A single spark could ignite tar-sealed timbers. A tipped brazier could set sail and rope ablaze within seconds. Fire at sea meant the loss of the ship, the cargo, and every man aboard. Yet the Vikings sailed anyway. They crossed from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to the coast of North America, journeys that took weeks, sometimes months, in conditions where prolonged cold exposure leads to hypothermia, frostbite, and death. The question is not whether they suffered, they did, but how they survived at all. The answer lies not in a single trick, but in a system. A system that modern observers might find troubling, even forbidden, because it required Vikings to endure conditions we would classify as unhealthy or unsafe. But to understand why this system worked, we must first understand what it was designed to prevent. Hypothermia occurs when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it. At sea, this happens through 4 pathways: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Wet clothing accelerates conduction. Wind strips away warmth through convection. Radiation pulls heat from exposed skin. And sweat, even in freezing temperatures, evaporates and cools the body further. For a Viking sailor on deck, all 4 processes worked simultaneously to drain life-sustaining warmth. The solution was not to generate heat externally, but to trap it internally. And the Vikings did this by creating a microenvironment, a sealed, insulated space around the body that minimized heat loss and maximized retention. The evidence suggests they understood something we now call vapor barrier theory. If you can stop moisture from moving through your insulation, you preserve its effectiveness. The Vikings didn't have Gore-Tex, but they had materials that worked on the same principle. The foundation of this system was wool. Not just any wool, but the dense, lanolin-rich fleece of North Atlantic sheep. Lanolin is a natural grease that repels water while allowing the fiber to breathe. Viking sailors wore multiple layers of woolen undergarments, tightly woven and often felted to increase wind resistance. Felting compresses wool fibers into a dense mat that traps air, a natural insulator, while shedding external moisture. But wool alone was not enough. Wet wool loses much of its insulating value, and salt spray was constant. The Vikings layered their wool beneath an outer shell designed to block wind and water entirely. This shell was not leather, which stiffens and cracks in freezing temperatures. It was sailcloth. Heavy woolen sailcloth, saturated with tar. Tarred sailcloth was impermeable. It stopped wind. It shed water. And most importantly, it acted as a vapor barrier, trapping body heat and moisture inside the insulated layers beneath. Archaeologists have found fragments of such garments in burial sites and shipwrecks, hooded cloaks, long tunics, even full body wraps that covered the wearer from head to foot. These garments were stiff, heavy, and reeked of tar and fish oil. But they worked. Fish oil, seal oil, and rendered animal fat were applied to both wool and skin. Oil creates a hydrophobic layer that repels water and reduces evaporative cooling. It also seals small gaps in fabric weave. The cost was discomfort. Oil-soaked clothing clung to the body. It trapped sweat and breath condensation inside. It created a damp, clammy environment against the skin. But dampness from the inside was survivable. Dampness from the outside cold seawater was not. What they were doing, essentially, was building a wearable shelter. The outer layer kept the environment out. The middle layer trapped air. The inner layer managed moisture. It wasn't pleasant, but it kept core temperature stable. The system extended beyond clothing. On longer voyages, Vikings used tarred hides and sailcloth to construct windbreaks on deck-low barriers that shielded resting men from direct gale-force winds. At night, or during storms, sailors huddled together beneath shared tarps, using collective body heat to raise the temperature inside these makeshift shelters. This practice, known from saga descriptions and ship layouts, created pockets of warmer air where men could recover between shifts. Sleep was rotational. Men worked the rigging, baled water, adjusted sails, then retreated beneath cover to warm themselves while others took their place. The rhythm was dictated not by comfort, but by the limit of human endurance. A man could work in freezing wind for perhaps 2 hours before his hands lost dexterity and his judgment faltered. Then he had to warm himself, or risk becoming a liability to the crew. The archaeological evidence for this system is indirect, but compelling. Textile fragments recovered from Viking Age contexts show high concentrations of lanolin, fish oil, and tar. Wear patterns on garment edges suggest layering and overlap designed to prevent gaps. Chemical analysis of residues on ship timbers indicates the regular use of animal fats and oils in areas where men slept or sheltered, and skeletal remains from known seafarers show bone markers consistent with chronic cold exposure, thickened periosteum, joint inflammation but not acute frostbite or hypothermia death. What remains uncertain is the degree of individual variation. Wealthier Vikings likely had access to better materials, finer wool, higher-grade seal oil, layered fur trim. Poorer sailors may have relied on coarser textiles and rendered fish fat. Some men tolerated the system better than others. Some may have died from it, because the system had costs. Prolonged exposure to trapped moisture and oil-soaked fabric led to skin infections, chafing, and fungal growth. The lack of ventilation meant that sweat and breath condensation accumulated inside the garment layers, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. Tar and oil fumes, concentrated in confined shelters, likely caused respiratory irritation, and the psychological toll of enduring weeks in cold, damp, uncomfortable conditions cannot be measured, but should not be dismissed. They weren't trying to be comfortable. They were trying to not die. That's a very different design goal. There is also the question of what happened when the system failed. If a man fell overboard, his oil-soaked clothing would absorb seawater and pull him down. If a garment tore, wind could penetrate the insulation and cause rapid heat loss. If a sailor became too fatigued to change position or adjust his layers, he could develop localized frostbite even while his core remained warm. The system required constant attention, constant adjustment, and a degree of physical resilience that was itself a product of harsh selection. Not every Viking sailor survived his first voyage. Those who did learned to read their own bodies, when to add a layer, when to remove one, when to seek shelter, when to keep moving. They learned which oils worked best, which fabrics held up longest, which positions minimized wind exposure. This knowledge was passed down, refined, and adapted across generations. It became part of the maritime culture, as essential as knowing how to trim a sail or navigate by the stars. What this tells us about Viking engineering is that they understood systems. They did not rely on a single technology or material, but on the integration of multiple elements: wool, oil, tar, sailcloth, body heat, collective shelter, into a coherent whole. They recognized that survival at sea was not about defeating the cold, but about managing it, about creating conditions where the human body could sustain itself long enough to reach land. This was not innovation born from comfort or leisure. It was adaptation driven by necessity. The North Atlantic gave the Vikings no choice but to solve the problem of warmth without fire, or abandon their ambitions entirely. They chose to solve it, and in doing so, they demonstrated a principle that would define their age: that the harshest environments demand not the strongest individuals, but the most carefully designed systems. The longship carried them across oceans. But it was the system, the layers, the barriers, the collective warmth that brought them home alive.